Well, good morning, everybody, and how are you this beautiful morning? It is a beautiful day in the neighborhood, and you may hear a little bit of an echo in the background because I have the speakers up just a touch here in the control room so that I can hear what I'm doing just a little bit because I got something special I want to throw at you this morning. How about that? Do you ever just think about what, the way things used to be? A little bit of nostalgia. Let me set that light a little bit better. Maybe that won't glare as much. You remember back when we were in school, back when we were fresh out of school and just starting our adult lives? You remember when we were teenagers? You remember all those times? And even when we were kids. Last night, I was ran across a picture on Facebook on one of the broadcast engineering sites where I'm the frequent. And it was a picture of a little transistor radio, just like one that I had when I was a kid. It got me to thinking about where that little transistor radio took me. Just a little cheap transistor radio that my sister bought me when I guess I was about 10 years old. And, but it opened the window and opened the doors for me into the world of broadcasting. And eventually, excuse me, that led to a career as a broadcast engineer and many years of ministering on radio and television and just all of that, So I sometimes when I'm thinking about all that, I kind of get nostalgic and think about, where it all started. And I think today that's what we're going to talk about a little bit is where it all started. How did it all start with you? The book of Revelation tells us that they overcame by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives even unto the death. If you enjoy what you do for a living, you didn't work that hard. Although you may have put in long hours, you may have studied hard, you may have labored, but you know what? It was a labor of love. And that's the way it's been for me in broadcasting and everything else. And but so many different ways that we look at nostalgia. So I'm going to take you back for just a moment. I'm going to take you back to a time and a place where we had these things, record albums. Okay. And I have hundreds of them stacked up over here, as you can tell. Here's J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet. Special for you this morning.
Just over in the glory land there with that mighty host I stand. Just over in the glory land, just over in the glory land I'll join that happy angel band. Just over in the glory land, I'm a home prepared where the saints abide. Just over in the glory land, and I long to be by my Savior's side. Just over in the glory land, just over in the glory land, with that mighty host I'll stand. Just over in the glory land, just over in the glory land I'll join that happy angel band. Just over in the glory land. Just over in the glory land with that mighty host I stand. Just over in the glory land, just over in the glory land I'll join that happy angel band. Just over in the glory land.
That was J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet, and a song that I hope that took you back a few days. It took me back a few days. Took me back to places like Gospel Light Baptist Church and Browder Holler Baptist Church and a few other places like that, and over to 6th Avenue Church of God, and just over in the glory land. And I like the way they sing that too. They sing that like they were excited about it. Have you ever gone to a church and heard them sing a song like that. It's just over in the glory. Oh, makes you want to grab a pen and poke somebody so that they'll shout a little bit and maybe they'll speed that thing up. Maybe put some electricity to that pianist bench. Oh, or maybe turn a squirrel loose in the church like what one very famous country singer tells about. But doesn't that bring back memories of years and years ago? Because so many of these songs are not sung in church anymore. Maybe a bygone era. There's a lot of things that are bygone eras. Did you know that? There's a lot of things that are bygone eras. I can move that mic back a little bit now. There's a lot of things that are bygone eras. Back when I started into electronics, back as a teenager, here's one of the books that I studied. Can you see the date on that? 1972. Radio Amateur's Handbook. That was the handbook of ham radio from the American Radio Relay League, an organization of amateur radios. But you'll notice it's thick. That's because if you look inside of it, it's 2 columns per page plus illustrations. Obtaining one of these books and then reading through it, studying it, it started off talking about amateur radio. I'm going somewhere with this, trust me. Then it started talking about electrical laws and circuits, and there's where it began to tell about all the different components and how they worked, how a piece of wire can become a coil, how resistors and capacitors work, and then it got into transformers and different types of transformers and combining AC and DC circuits. Then it got into something called tube circuits, and we studied tubes. Well, by the time I got out of high school, I had studied enough electronics that I knew that's the direction I wanted to go. And then one of these books came along. And the more I studied it, the more I wanted to do work on radio. I already knew I wanted to work in radio stations and TV stations. I didn't think I'd ever work in a TV station. But as I read these books gave me the foundation so that when I started studying electronics formally, I already knew a lot. And it made it a lot easier for me to move forward because I understood the basics. I understood the fundamentals. Thinking about all of that, that was 50 years ago when I graduated high school. 49 years ago, I'm sorry. I better say 49 of those girls that graduated with me will have my hide. But 49 years ago when I graduated from high school, I wanted to go that direction. And I began to work toward that goal. I found a job. It wasn't the job I wanted, but it was a job. And it paid for my electronics training. So that I could get a job. And I did. Got a job in electronics. Studied and passed my FCC license exams, which were tough. They were tough. Sat before a board of FCC examiners. That's a group of FCC engineers that would supervise and oversee and proctor the exams. And there's no way you could cheat on them. A lot of people, they went to a school where they just memorized answers to the test pool. All the questions that were in the test. I didn't. I studied electronics. Did it the hard way. Passed those tests and got my license. And it opened doors for me. So that I began to be able to work and make a living and make a good living at it. And then later make a very good living at it. And I continued to do that and still do. I still work on a couple of radio stations at 67 years of age. Still using the same knowledge that I acquired in these books. And as you saw on this one even has a date on the front of it, 1972. That's not the original one. The original one is well worn out and gone to the trash bin by now. But that's one that I found in a resale store, and I picked it up because it was one just like one I had years ago. The pages are all brown in it, but from age, because it's printed on newsprint. But the things that I learned back then, the basics, the fundamentals that I learned, were things that carried me through a lot of different technology. And I could understand how different transmitters worked without having to go to school on that particular transmitter or that particular piece of equipment, because I understood how the circuitry was put together. And still to this day, I can design component level in electronics. That's a rarity in today's world. Many engineers coming out of college are not prepared to do that. A few years ago, I acquired my engineering degree, but it was 30 years after I graduated high school. And for me, that was an accomplishment because it was something I always wanted. Didn't have it for most of my career, but that didn't stop me from working as an engineer or making an engineer's salary. Because you see, I was good at what I did because I studied the fundamentals and I studied the basics until I had them down strongly embedded in my mind. Now, where is he going with this? I think some of you have already figured it out. When you grow up with this book, studying this book, and reading this book, you may acquire a certain amount of information about the fundamentals. We may have learned in Sunday school classes all the stories, or a lot of the stories of the Old Testament. But it's not until you begin to study in earnest with a hunger to learn because you have a motivation to learn that the stories become reality, and the things that are read in those stories, the lessons that you learn from them, become ingrained into your mind and into your spirit. This is probably the newest Bible that I have. It was given to me by Brother Randy Headings a couple of years ago when I was consecrated as a bishop over a ministry organization back March of 2020. And that's even what it says on the front. It says Bishop Rick Tallent. So much for titles. But every time that I read, every time that I go back to one of these books, and I read about a circuit or I read about a particular application, like an antenna. Here a while back, I needed an antenna to pick up AM really, really good on my radio that I have right here. I have a car radio mounted right here underneath this shelf where my monitor is located. It's an old Toyota car radio, and man, it picks up like crazy on that big antenna I put outside. But I picked up my book, I studied a little bit, refreshed my memory. And I remembered a few things, and I built an antenna that's mounted up above the basketball goal in my front yard. And that antenna, man, it picks up, and at night, I can pick up stations from all over the United States. In the daytime, it's amazing what I can pick up. But I understood about how to build an antenna. I already do that. I've been installing antennas and tuning antennas for radio and television transmitters for years, decades. And know about RF, which is radio frequency stuff. It's area of expertise. But I still went back and I read up a little bit on long wire antennas and that particular antenna that for the particular frequency I wanted to pick up, which is called medium wave. That's AM radio, AM broadcast radio for y'all. And I was able to build an antenna that is just exceptional in its ability to draw in the signal. I began to think about that earlier this morning as I was looking for a cable to extend the wire around and better route the wiring coming to this radio, the antenna wiring. I was thinking, when I was a kid, what got me started was a little transistor radio that my sister gave me. And I found out that if I held it next to the screen in my window, that it picked up better. Then I found out that if I wrapped a piece of wire, Daddy used to bring home wire from where he worked at the construction site where they were building a steam plant. And there'd be this yellow coated, yellow jacketed copper wire that he told us it was dynamite wire. I have to take his word for it. That it was scrap, and he would pick up big pieces of it and wind it up and stick it in his lunchbox, stick it in his pocket, in his lunchbox, bring it home. And I had plenty of that available. So I wrapped it around my radio and tied it in, twisted it in a knot and ran it over and hooked it up to the screen, the metal screen wire. That's back when screens in windows were metal. And man, all of a sudden I was picking up stations even during the daytime that I couldn't before. And thinking about all of those things are nostalgic. And thinking about back in Sunday school class, I have right here my little New Testament given to me by a Sunday school teacher when I was just 6 or 7 years old. You see it? It's been through the war. It's been through hurricanes and everything else. It sits right here underneath my monitor. I listen to old music like J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet. And I'm reminded that there are a lot of fundamentals that are lost in today's world. Someone coming out of so-called electronic school today is not taught what I was taught. They're not taught component level design. They're not taught component level troubleshooting. They're not taught the level of studying into the theory of antennas and tube. Forget tube theory. Tubes don't exist anymore, according to the electronic schools. Right. I have a whole box of them downstairs. I can take you to transmitter sites where the transmitters still use tubes. But they don't teach that anymore. And we don't teach Sunday school the way we used to. I have a number of old commentaries. I have purchased a lot of them. A complete series of old commentaries back into the 70s and the 60s and even up into the 80s. And what you read in those commentaries, those Sunday school commentaries, is far different than what you read in today's commentaries. What you read in today's commentaries is pretty lackluster compared to the meat and potatoes that is in the older commentaries, the older Sunday school lessons. And I have to wonder, as my generation gets older and the technology that we know leaves here with us, will there be craftsmen? And thinking about my My late ex-father-in-law, Jack Johnson, reminded me of this as well. He was a craftsman. He could design and build anything with wood, metal, whatever. New gardening, planted a big garden every year, always had more harvest than what he could stand. But if he could conceive it in his mind, he could build it. So much of that is being lost because it's no longer being taught. We don't have craftsmen like that coming up in our schools because our schools don't teach it. Because our schools have decided that a computer can do everything. But what happens when you don't have that computer? Let me tell you what happens. In this book, there are truths that you have to dig out, that you have to mine like mining gold or diamonds or rubies. Or there's truths in this book that are like pearls. You have to dive down deep and hold on and persevere to find that clam that's got a crack in it, and where a piece of sand has gotten inside that clam and turned into a pearl. You're not going to find that with today's loosey-goosey theology. You're not going to find it in our secularized seminaries, where you have professors that believe in psychology more than they believe in God, and many that do not believe in God at all, even in our Christian institutions. And for that matter, our Christian institutions have turned into secular institutions because they accept money from government sources, and the government tells them what they can and can't teach. I learned a lot sitting at the feet of great men of God whose names you will never hear and know on national television. They don't have a Wikipedia page. They didn't publish a biography about them. Guys like Sanford B. Tutterow and Eli Estes and Paul Faulkner and Ray Kelly and Jimmy Pelham and others. Pastors like Paul Shoemaker from the Church of God. Bill Jackson. Sunday school teachers like Curtis Fritz and Tom Evanson. Men that I learned the Word of God from, and men that I learned about becoming a Christian man. There's things I learned from my dad, who only had a 7th grade education. But he was a man of great intelligence because he had learned the hard way. He had graduated from the School of Hard Knocks and was still an avid student. Amateur radio is not the same today either. When I went to get my amateur radio license, KN4GZW, took the test, piece of cake. I've been studying electronics for 50 years. Finally got around to getting my amateur license. But they don't build radios anymore. They don't build antenna tuners anymore. They don't build any of this. They buy it pre-made, and it's all computerized. This little radio here will pick up VHF and UHF, and it's got a memory of 200 channels. You just hook it up to the computer and you program the channels in you want it to pick up. It'll pick up everything from 150 megahertz up through almost or right at 500 megahertz. Hold it in the palm of my hand, about the size of a pack of cigarettes. But sitting up there on the shelf is my late friend David Lewis's Heathkit shortwave radio that was given to me when he passed away. It's about 8 inches tall and 18 inches wide and about 18 inches deep, and it weighs about 40 pounds. And it's loaded down with tubes and air variable capacitors and big old coils that look like they're made out of number 12 wire. This one, you use a computer in it, and you know exactly what frequency you're on and everything. A big shortwave radio setting up there, you got to know what you're doing to be able to use it, to be able to tune it, to be able to use it. I'm saying all that to say this. It's not just nostalgia, folks. It's reality. We need to get back to learning the fundamentals. We need to get back to learning the basics. We need to start teaching the fundamentals again and get away from all of this modernist idea that the answer to everything is found in a computer or a cell phone or a pocket electronic device. We need to get back to the time when we have to learn how to wire something like that. I remember wiring up telephones with batteries that I pulled out of the trash can at the AT&T at Bell Telephone. Wire up 2 phones with a battery across them, and I learned I could make a telephone system. 8, 9, 10 years old, 11, 12 years old. Folks, the same thing applies in electronics. The same thing applies in the Word of God. It applies in electronics. If you don't understand and know the fundamentals, you'll never, never be as strong and knowledgeable as you need to be. Without the computer, most of society is totally helpless. Except for those of us who are now gray-headed. You know why? Because we still remember the fundamentals. We learned the fundamentals. We learned the basics. I can still go into my shop and I can grab a handful of components and grab that box full of tubes and a soldering iron, and I can design and I can build a radio receiver or a radio transmitter. Don't have to have a computer to do it. And I don't have to have a computer to know the Word of God. We better get back to basics, folks. We better get back to basics. Because if we don't, there will be a generation, the next generation coming up, that will have no concept of the fundamentals of the Word of God that we know. Until next time, this is Rick Tallent saying go with God, because He has already gone before you and prepared the way. He is your rear guard. And no matter what happens, my friend, He will always be right there by your side.